Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel, and today we are doing a season debrief of Cloud9's 2023 season in the VCT. Cloud9 was a very interesting team last year. Even before the season started, they were making big splashes, picking up Ye, who was previously the best player in the entire world, also picking up Zelsis, having Vanity return, and it looked like this team might be one of the best teams in the VCT or in the entire world going into that season. And then suddenly Sao Paulo happens, they lose pretty early on, and then they drop both Vanity and Ye, two of their off-season pickups, and then they pick up new players, and then, people are like, well, they're probably not going to be as good. And then they end up having a really, really strong regular season, being one of the best teams in Americas. But then the playoffs happened, and they didn't get very far. They got fourth in the Americas playoffs, and then they just didn't make it to any international tournament at all. So a team that came in with high expectations, especially being a part of the Cloud9 organization, being one of the biggest esports companies in the entire world, and then maybe had those expectations lowered once they made the players switch that they did, and then as the season went along, really high expectations because they were doing really well, and then those expectations were not met at all. So it was quite the roller coaster of a season for this team and Cloud9 fans. So it leaves this team with some really big question marks for this offseason, and we're going to talk about their whole year and see maybe where things went wrong. So for their best placement, I have them placing third in the last chance qualifiers, losing to Leviathan. You could also put the regular season performance, but in the standings, all that counts in terms of each league is just where you place during the playoffs. So that would mean that they placed fourth in Americas, but they were first going into those playoffs, so you could say that. But I'm going with third in last chance qualifiers for that category. Other placements, as previously mentioned, they got fourth in Americas, losing in the playoffs, having an embarrassing loss to Evil Geniuses, and then losing to Energy. So it was a very rough time for that team, and it seemed like, how are they going to recover from this? And they just didn't. And as previously mentioned, this team did go 8-1 during the regular season, only losing to Loud. So a team that was nearly undefeated, looking pretty elite during that regular season, really did not get anywhere super high aside from that regular season. So it's quite something to say about this team, where they can play well consistently, but when it comes to the really big moments, maybe they don't really shine very well. And that's kind of been the story of Cloud9 throughout their entire history in Valorant, basically. This team has tried again and again to get really good results, and they've had some decent performances at certain tournaments, but nothing super high, especially not for this org that definitely really wants to do well in Valorant. They have a very storied history in CSGO, so they obviously want to have a very storied history in Valorant, but it just hasn't happened so far. And while they have a large fan base, they also just haven't had the results that fan base probably is demanding. And that is no better said than in the fact that this team has won 0 championships throughout their entire time in Valorant. Now, this is just for the organization, but also none of their players have won a championship, at least on an international championship in the VCT. So none of these players have won, and the org hasn't won itself either. And the most recent news about this team is that Zelsis is leaving. He is an unrestricted free agent as of recording. Now, we'll get to a bit more about Zelsis later, but it is unfortunate that he's leaving Cloud9. It was an up and down season for him. He had some really good moments, had some not so good moments, but Zelsis is a solid player. He's a good role guy. He's a good personality guy. I'm sure he'll find a home somewhere else in Tier 1, and if not, I'm sure some Tier 2 team will pick him up, and he will be a welcome addition to any roster that he is a part of. And more changes are probable for this team. This team has had Leaf and Zeppa on it for quite a long time now, more than most players last on teams. Esports teams cut players very quickly, even just based off of like one bad result after some really good ones. Just look at Energy. They had a pretty decent year, being one of the better teams in Americas, having a roster full of former championship winners, and they're probably rebuilding most, if not all of that roster. They are probably keeping Crashies and Victor, but even so, they're dropping Artists, they're dropping FNS and Som. They've already dropped those players. So it just goes to show that even if you have a good year, that just one bad result like they had in Champions, that can really tank your chances of staying together as a team. But Cloud9, to their credit, haven't really done that, at least not with Leaf and Zeppa. They have with Ye and Vanity, as previously mentioned, and that was pretty ruthless of them, especially after just 5 maps, but apparently that was because of role issues, and that has been repeated by the head coach, MCE. So apparently it wasn't a money issue, which was speculated at the time. It was due to the fact that they just weren't the right players to fit role-wise, and they wanted a new IGL, and Vanity just wasn't doing it for them. At that point, he had been on the team for a decent long amount of time before that. So it did make sense that they dropped those players due to role issues, but also, why did you pick them up in the first place if you knew that was going to happen? Because I understand why a team can't exactly have Leaf and Ye on it, because they are very similar players. Ye, at least coming into that season, was the better player, but I guess they liked Leaf's versatility a bit more, because, you know, he does play a lot of Jet and a lot of Duelist, but he can play different characters pretty well, and Ye, you know, hadn't really shown that as much. He is now trying to get roles in Tier 1 teams as maybe not a Duelist, maybe not just an opping Jet or Chamber. We'll see if that works, but Leaf did show that he's a bit more versatile, so maybe that's why they kept him over Ye. They also maybe had a bit more loyalty to Leaf because they've had him for a while. Who's to say what really happened behind the scenes, but that is at least the kind of reasoning that I can think of. But anyway, to really get into the nitty-gritty of this team and their year, we have to look at their statistics. So what is shown on the board here is the amount of maps that each player played, which is right beside their name, and then their kills, their deaths, and their assists, and then their KD ratio to finish that off. Obviously, these are not the only stats that matter in Valorant and in tactical shooters, but, you know, these are at least pretty decent stats to just show general performance. Anyway, starting off the list, we have the previously mentioned Leaf. He had 745 kills, 674 deaths, 224 assists for a KD ratio of 1.10. Leaf during the regular season was statistically one of the best players in the entire Americas. In fact, I think he was second behind AssPass going into playoffs. So expectations were really high for him, and then he just really did not play well in those playoffs after that, especially not against EG, and he really couldn't come up big when he was called upon it. To his credit, he did have a good last chance qualifiers, but we all know how that ended, so it doesn't really matter. If this team had gotten into Masters Tokyo right away, like they probably should have, they wouldn't have had to be in last chance qualifiers, and they would just be in Champions. But unfortunately, they just could not get up in that moment, and they just lost to teams that just ended up being better than them. Leaf is still a very good player. I do expect Cloud9 to keep on to him, but I am curious as to see how long he still has on this roster, because ever since he's been on this team, they haven't really done much. They have made it to some international tournaments, I believe Champions 2021, but is that the only one that they've been to aside from Sao Paulo? I think it might be. So how long are you really going to give this guy to really give you the results that you want? Obviously, you want to keep a player of that talent level, and finding a player to match that talent level is difficult. But at some point, you have to stop driving into the same wall. So we'll see how long he has. And a player that I think definitely doesn't have as much time is Zeppa. Zeppa has been on Cloud9 for almost as long as Leaf, joining in 2021 as well. During this season, in 45 maps, he had 655 kills, 665 deaths, 336 assists for a KD ratio of 0.98. So under 1, so he did have slightly more deaths than kills, only 10. It's not that big of a difference, which is still good, but for the player that has the second most kills on your team, you're going to want that KD ratio to be better. Again, it's not the only stat that matters, especially in his case where he was playing more flex. But even so, you are going to want a better ratio for supposedly your second best player. Next up, we have Zelsis, who is no longer on the team, but in 45 maps, he had 589 kills, 586 deaths, 246 assists for a KD ratio of 1.0. Obviously, it's not exactly 1.0 because his kills and deaths are not exact, but it's off by 3, so it's like 1.005, whatever. doesn't really matter. It's close enough to even, so here it is. And Zelsis, as I said, he's a good role player. He has a great personality. He's a really fun guy, and I do think he will find another Tier 1 team. He has shown that he can come up in some really big moments. I remember during his stint with Sentinels, he was very good for them during that very short amount of time. He was a solid player on version 1 before that, and I think Sentinels probably wanted to keep him, but knew that with the new franchise league coming into that season, that maybe they wanted to completely rebuild the roster, and maybe Zelsis just wasn't in their vision. Or maybe the price to buy him out from version 1 was maybe a bit too steep for the company at the time, and knowing their financial situation is bad right now, that's not exactly a surprise. But maybe Sentinels wants to rebuild the roster as well, and Zelsis may be a player that they look at again. He did gel well with that team during that last chance qualifier last year, so maybe they want to do it. You know, I'm not saying that I have any information that's going to happen, but it's just speculation that maybe that could be a team that looks at him. Anyways, moving on, we are going to the two newest recruits who had some big shoes to fill, and that is Jakey and Rooney. Jakey played 40 maps. He had 551 kills, 585 deaths, 301 assists for a KD ratio of 0.94. Jakey was solid for them throughout the year, and especially coming in after the players that both him and Rooney replaced. It is some huge shoes to fill, and I would say that he filled them pretty well. Not really being a super well-known player or anything, he did come in as an underdog. He had a lot to prove, and I do think he proved it, but he wasn't over the moon good. He wasn't as good as Ye was in 2022. So maybe you wanted more out of him. I don't know if he's going to be leaving the team. They might want to keep him because him and Rooney did have good performances. But I do think that, like, while he is good, just like Zelsis, ultimately he is replaceable. Ultimately, you can fill those shoes somewhere else if you decide to kick him off the roster. So I wouldn't be entirely surprised if he does end up leaving, but there's also a decent chance that he stays. I really don't know what this roster is going to do. We don't really have any news aside from Zelsis right now, so we'll see what happens. But, you know, Jakey could be on the chopping block. He could not. We don't know yet. We'll find out. Next up, we have their IGL in Rooney. In 40 maps, he had 526 kills, 553 deaths, 284 assists for a KD ratio of 0.95. Rooney was really solid for them, especially as an IGL. He definitely came in not as experienced as most of the other IGLs or the IGL he was replacing, so it was definitely a lot of pressure on him, but I'd say he proved himself well. And I think he proved himself enough to be able to stay on the roster, and I do think that Cloud9 probably keeps him because they probably don't want to go looking for another IGL when they have one that proved that he is at least decent. He wasn't able to take this team to an international tournament after joining, but he was able to take this team to an 8-1 regular season. And, you know, he's still young and he's still not as experienced, but now he has more experience, especially in Tier 1. So now he can come into next season and really know what he's doing. And if Cloud9 does drop him, I think some other team is going to be happy to scoop him up. So just looking at their stats overall, it's not exactly something that you would look at and say that this team is particularly elite. You have one player who's well above 1 on his KD ratio, you have another who's just barely above it, and then the rest were all below even for their KD ratios, one getting very close with 0.98 in Zeppa. I did miss an A on his name, by the way. And again, these stats are not exactly everything when it comes to Valorant, but it is kind of surprising to look at this team and see that they really didn't have a lot of players just fragging out all the time and not getting a low amount of deaths. A lot of these players just died a lot, and they, you know, maybe just didn't get as many kills as they would have wanted. So, I mean, doing that while having an 8-1 regular season, almost going undefeated, it is surprising that these stats are as low as they really are. When you look at teams like Energy only had one player that was below 1 on their KD ratio. Granted, they did play more maps, but that should also mean that those stats should be lower. If you play less maps, those stats should be higher because there's more, you know, there's bigger margins, or smaller margins, I should say. So while, again, comparing these stats is not the end-all, be-all, it is surprising that a team that looked elite at one point during the season doesn't really have the greatest stats when it comes to kills and deaths. And this is also evident in their map pool. So going over their maps, we have all of their maps and the stats that they had throughout the season. Haven, they played 7 times. They had a 2-5 record on it with a win percentage of 29%, an attack percentage of 62, and a defense win percentage of 32. So really bad stats on Haven. If you wanted to beat this team, go to Haven. And a lot of teams that are really elite have a really good Haven, and especially don't have a record on a map such as Haven like that. That's a very low win percentage and a very bad percentage on defense. So while it is more of an attack-sided map, it's definitely worse that you have, these kind of stats. So if you just wanted to beat this team on a map, just pick Haven. And it doesn't seem like they banned it all that often because they played it 7 times. It's one of their most played maps at the entire season. So no idea why that is, but here it is. Next up, we have Bind. They played it 2 times, lost both of those times, so 0% on the win percentage there, 20% on attack, 33 on defense. Now, these are just 2 matches, but man, those are really bad numbers, and that is very rough for them. And and again, if you want to beat them, you can just take them to Bind. Energy, they have a very good Bind. They have a very good Haven. This is a team that should have been a lot better on these maps, but here we are, and it's just not a great record. And if you look at their maps overall, there's really not a map that they're super dominant on. They do have Pearl, which they played 9 times with a 7-2 record, 78% win percentage, attack was 53, and defense was 60. So those are solid numbers there, and that's definitely good to have, especially on Pearl, which is one of the newer maps. Their split record is solid. They played it 5 times, 4-1, 80% win percentage, 62% on attack, and 58 on defense. That's another good one, but they didn't play it very many times. At least it's about, I guess, tied for their 3rd amount played. Lotus, they played 9 times, 7-2 record on there with a win percentage of 78, attack 67, and defense 53. They have a good record on Ascent as well. They played it 7 times, 5-2, win percentage of 71, attack 52, defense 60. Good numbers there for Ascent and those last 3 maps. Fracture, decent record as well. They played it 5 times, 3-2, so just barely a positive win percentage there. Their attack is a mediocre 45%, but their defense is a decent 54. Icebox, they did play it 1 time, 0-1 record on there. Didn't win. Their attack was 33, their defense was 8. That is just 1 map, but those numbers are bad. So what I mean by they don't really have a map that they're super good on is while they do have good stats on a lot of these maps, and having 7-2 record on Lotus and Pearl, that's great and all, but it doesn't seem like they were extremely dominant on any of these maps. When you look at some of the really elite teams, they have maps that they're super dominant on. Look at Evil Geniuses with Ascent, look at Energy with Bind, look at Loud with Haven and Ascent. These top teams have a map that they can just absolutely lock down, and while they were able to lock down Lotus, Ascent, and Pearl most of the time, they were still able to be taken down on these maps. And if you're an elite team, that just can't happen. And these numbers aren't overwhelmingly successful when you look at each, side's like win percentage. Lotus is 67 on attack. That's really good. But a defense of 53, you maybe would want that higher for one of your better maps. And they have a clear weakness in Haven and Bind. They did just play Bind 2 times, but losing both of those times and having pretty mediocre numbers on both attack and defense for those 2 matches, that's not great either. So whatever iteration of this team comes into existence for the 2024 season, they're going to have a better plan and a better strategy for a lot of these maps. And they're going to have to find a map that they are really dominant on, that they can lock down, that they can have a perfect plan on. Because if you don't have that, you're just not one of the top teams in the world. Having decent stats on a lot of maps is good, and having a deep map pool is good, but you need 1 or 2 maps that you're super good at, and then have a lot of the other maps be you're very good on them, but not like perfect. That's what you should have as an elite team. That's what a lot of those elite teams do. So whatever version of this team we see next year, they're going to have to figure that out. They're going to have to find a way to get more kills from players that aren't just named Leaf. Rooney, if he stays on, is going to have to step up his IGLing ability. I think he will. I think he's just getting started, and he showed some really, really good IGLing during the regular season and during last chance qualifiers as well. I think he'll be really solid for them if he stays. Leaf, he is going to stay. I'm pretty sure he is their best player, and he's kind of carried this team through a lot. You know, a lot of these decent placements that they've had are because Leaf is on the team. We'll see what happens to the likes of Zeppa and Jakey. I can see Zeppa staying, but I think if they get off to a slow start, again, I can see Zeppa being one of the players that they take out of the roster, even if he's not the problem. I don't think he's the problem, but I do think at some point this organization's patience is going to run out. They have spent a lot of money on the roster. They've gotten some good players, and they've really wanted to do well, and it just hasn't happened yet. So we'll see how the dominoes fall, and this is definitely going to be one of the more interesting teams to watch during the offseason. Anyways, let me know what you guys think of Cloud9 and how they did during the 2023 season. Was the regular season just a flash in the pan, or can they actually be that good consistently if they iron out some things? Let me know what you think and what roster changes you think they should do as well. Anyways, that's it. Thank you all very much for watching. Please click like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye.